Testing the audio. Testing the audio real quick. Boom,
Test,
boom, boom,
test.
boom. Yep.
Check.
All right. We're finally live from the Man Cave studio. And it gives me a black screen. That's not cool. That's not cool at all. We're just having lots of fun, guys. Going straight to the table shot, which is zoomed in goofy. So I'm coming back to Super Source. Here we go. What in the actual world is going on here? Welcome to the show, everybody. It appears to me we're going to have a lot of fun. In fact, Nico, I'm going to hit the record button here just to record it, just in case. But give me a 5x5. All right, Gypsy Magic says we're good. Nico, hit that one that includes Dave, the second one, right? Not how we figured that out? Okay. I'm not seeing it on my end, but that's okay. Can you hear us, Dave?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, all right. For some reason,
Where's Dave?
I'm not seeing you. No, it's fine. We're going to have to deal with that tonight, guys. When we look over at the show, I'm going to have you guys look over here. It'll be here in just a second.
There's Dave Benner.
All right, so you guys will see him like that.
Oh, yeah.
For some reason, I've got to fix that now. Next show. Next show. Zoom is listen. These are far less complicated problems than when I'm using Zoom. I literally have to fire up like 2 other extra computers to control and do everything. So this, I'll get the bugs worked out. But for tonight, we're going to be all right. It is what it is. I scooted the wrong way, didn't I?
Yeah, we got to keep going.
Yeah, we're actually now centered.
Yeah, you guys will be fine. We'll keep adjusting. Dave, you're here. We're going to go for it. This is my brain. This is how my brain works. There's a lot of crazy things in old Duder's brain here, and so we're gonna keep it. Welcome to the show. I am Jeremy Scott Gibbs. Dennis Marburger is here. Dave Benner. I said that right?
Yeah.
I always want to put an R in there, Dave. This is your second time on the show, and it's been a cluster each time, but welcome to the show anyways. And, of course, Glenn Gogoleski, the Go-Go. And over there behind the counter, we got Nico helping me tonight. He's awesome. And so we're going to get right into it. American history conversation tonight. We want to talk about the true history of these United States. And I'm going to turn it over to Dennis with you, Dave, and kind of tee us off with our first topic. And I really want to dive into this with our 250th year, according to the Declaration of Independence. But there's much more history than that. And I want to dive into some of that. So, Dennis, go ahead, and you and Dave tee us off for tonight.
All right. Dave, great to see you here.
Yeah, good to see you too, Dennis, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome, despite that hat you're wearing. Other than that, everything's dandy. Yeah, he's wearing his Green Bay Packer hat there, see. But he has Red Wing paraphernalia, too, because he's also a Red Wing fan. But so
can't be all bad.
The 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Right? And some people say the 250th anniversary of...
Lean forward, Dennis. Nobody cares now that we're on the show.
Okay. The 250th anniversary of the United States of America. But really, the first Constitution for the United States wasn't done until the next year, right? 1770s.
Well, it was written, the Articles of Confederation were written primarily by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania in 1777, but that was not even ratified until 1781. So a lot of people call the Declaration of Independence a founding document, and it was really a declaration of secession. It was something of an anti-founding more than it was a founding document, not to take any of the significance from it, but it very much was a document that inspired or actually articulated the common cause of severance from Great Britain, not the consolidation of like a national state or anything like that.
right. And the thing, some people put it, I think Kevin Gussman says this, and he says actually the Declaration itself was not a legal document, but it was a political document, an expression of the right of the reasons for why they were doing what they were doing. Um, and some states had already seceded. I think was it Virginia and North Carolina? And
yeah,
then,
Virginia, North Carolina, and depending on who you ask, sometimes there's been resolutions that have been brought up to say, hey, this county seceded before the entire colonial government of this other one. I think Rhode Island actually seceded before that time too. But yeah, this was to articulate the reasons for which the Second Continental Congress voted on the Richard Henry Lee Amendment of July 2nd, 1776. And Jefferson wrote this document in a series of a few weeks while the rest of the Continental Congress was essentially in recess. And he actually didn't really want to write it. He had correspondence around that same time that said, let me back to Virginia, because at the same time the Virginia government was drafting a constitution for Virginia. Jefferson looked at the association with one's colonial government or the newly fledgling Republican state governments as the most important political association we can make, not one to any central entity, not to any national government. And that's just a key facet of, I think, the Declaration that a lot of people don't know.
well, that's a great point, Dave. In fact, it's interesting to look at how some of these dates come so close together. The first week of July, 1776, but also the year previous, 1777, right? The Declaration for the Necessity and Causes of Taking Up Arms. And as I recall, Dickinson and Jefferson, I think they wrote that, right? And one of their interesting things they put in there was that their first loyalty, our first loyalty should be to liberty as opposed to any particular nation or government. Is that essentially what they said there?
Sure. I would say both the olive branch petition and the document that was on the necessity of taking up arms was to explain the colonial standpoint for which the Patriots in Massachusetts took up arms against the British in Concord and Lexington. And that was the masterwork of both Dickinson and Jefferson. But at that time, there wasn't such a radical expression among the delegates to actually want to sever ties with Great Britain. Actually, the olive branch petition, you read that today, almost gets no recognition, but it called for, ameliorating differences with the crown. And even Jefferson in his 1774 pamphlet that talked about these things, he acknowledged that, the British government and the colonial connection to it was through the king. It wasn't through a parliament, and the colonies were able to legislate for themselves, but they did have a shared executive. So there was a transition that many of the most ardent supporters of independence went through, and Jefferson being one of them. There was a little bit different in terms of messaging that went on early in the Second Continental Congress.
Okay, and of course, many things preceded both 1775 and 1776, those events. Some say go back to 1761 with Otis, and what he was doing, fighting the writs of assistance and that sort of thing. And there was a famous court case that he lost, but his oratory inspired many people. Would that be a point at which you say we could maybe mark the beginning of the birth of this movement, or maybe something even earlier?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Dennis. I mean, John Adams would think so. A young John Adams was in the audience that day in a case called Paxton's case, because what had happened was the British unveiled the writs of assistance, or the general writs. It enabled officers of the British government to essentially rummage through the property of American citizens. And not really American citizens yet, but British subjects. And they said, hey, we're entitled to the rights of Englishmen. This is a perversion. James Otis, being, their star orator, once employed by the crown, is saying, a man's things and belongings and property is his castle. It lit a fuse in the American patriots so much that a young John Adams in the crowd that day said, the child of independence was then and there born. He really believed that this was one of the moments that spearheaded a changing of opinions from a very pro-British leaning populace to one that was much more accepting, relatively speaking, of the Patriots. Of course, those that did support the Patriot cause were something like only about a third of the colonies themselves. But that was a key transition point, and in germ, it did inspire what we now know as the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where searches and seizures can't transpire without a warrant. Of course, the feds violate that all the time. The state governments pervert our privacy rights too in the same fashion. But it is a focal point that's worth talking about, I think.
Absolutely, particularly given what's going on now. There's so many different roads or things we can pursue from this, both what's happening comparing today and that day, and how the long train of abuses is even worse as we live under the largest government in the history of the world. But also the involvement of these brave individuals and their families, and the Lee family. And you mentioned, of course, Richard Henry Lee with the Lee Resolution, and of course, like, of course, Harry Lee, then his son, of course, was Robert E. Lee, but the extended Lee family, but also the Otis family. And James Otis Jr.'s sister, right, Mercy Otis Warren, who became the muse of the American Revolution. And apparently the Otis family, that's the Otis elevator family eventually, as it turns out. But what these people did was just so inspirational and took so much courage. And we might contrast the courage and the integrity of those people with the level of civil engagement today, and we might find that we've had a big decline. What would you say, Dave?
Well, yeah, I think so too. Mercy Otis Warren wrote a famous 2-volume series on the war for independence, or the American Revolution, whatever you want to call it. I still think it holds up today. She was also part of the Massachusetts political elite, I would say, marrying Warren. And it's just there's so many pivotal moments from that time that's worth reflecting on, because some of the things we're dealing with today, that generation tried to build safeguards around, like not in getting into entangling alliances and building an empire around the world, not subjecting individual rights to majority rule votes, that being democracy that's put up on a pedestal as if it's some sacramental political theory today, and really it's a perversion of what the founding generation wanted. So there's so many things that generation reflected on that the American people just, I hate to say, has very little understanding of. And I think it's because mostly of a perversion in the education system and a century of welfare and warfare, and those two things going hand in hand to the detriment of American liberty.
Absolutely. It's been 250 years, and I think this is the time where Americans know the least amount of their history within the total span of the United States, from its inception to where we're at today. There has never been a time like this where people are so relatively clueless in terms of just the basic difference between democracy and a republic. The concept is so foreign to so many. And the danger in that, and yes, I agree, it starts in the schools. It starts where the children should be learning this stuff first and foremost, and it's glossed over, if that, and everything to this day is referred to as democracy.
Yeah, certainly so, man. But if you go back to, what Benjamin Franklin said about that, writing as Poor Richard Saunders, he said that democracy is essentially two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. It subjects,
Exactly.
a majority rule vote to pervert your liberty. It's
Right.
mob rule. It's something that the founders, whether that they supported the Constitution, they were Federalists, or they opposed it, totally despised. And every single mention of it, for instance, in the Federalist Papers, is in the negative. It's viewed as a pejorative. The founders look back at the Greek experience and the polis as examples where this system was run amok, and we should instead favor the best parts of the Roman Republican system instead. And that you can see that over and over. There are just no champions of democracy, I think, for good reason back then. But now today, again, a religious aura surrounds that word. And I think it's the ultimate reinventing, a refounding of sorts of the United States, to our great peril and detriment. So I agree with you, sir.
That was a great point raised by Glenn there. And I think we're all in agreement with what you had to say, Dave. You said it so eloquently. And so then the question, well, and the question becomes: is this done intentionally? And has there been a move over a very long period of time to either subvert or pervert or cover up the foundational principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that for which those American Revolutionary patriots gave so much, and then to put us in a situation which is worse than what they faced, and now today we have to re-educate everybody and bring these concepts back into the public view. On those sort of things. What would you say about that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think that it couldn't be intentional. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people are ignorant about this because they don't get these educational tidbits. They don't go back to the primary sources to either, confirm or validate or refute what they're being told in government schools. But there's lots of different junctures in history through which you can say, like, we shifted in a more democratic fashion. I think the biggest brunt of it was in the Wilsonian era. Wilson was a defender of democracy, and not only democracy in the United States, but spreading it around the world in globalist entities like the League of Nations that he supported, kind of the precursor of the UN of sorts. And we got stuff out of the progressive era like the 17th Amendment, which shifted the way in which senators were elected, such that the states who used to have a role in the federal government used to have senators elected by the state legislators and then given instructions on how to vote by the people in the state government, now perverted and tarnished into a direct, more democratic election to nominate them. We saw the fruits of this recently in South Carolina with Darlene Graham ascending to beat her primary opponent, and I think she goes on to the general election today. It sounds like that one is going to be another win for the political establishment and neocons, but now we have a U.S. Senate that's much more beholden to the Washington lobbies rather than their own home constituencies. Even though they're selling this as a democracy, it turns out the manifestation of this change in the system has been senators that are attached to national lobbies and not the state governments, and certainly not the individuals who, some of them rarely go back to their home districts and even meet their constituents. They're too busy talking to representatives from JP Morgan and Moderna and Lockheed Martin, and that's the truth.
Well, and sometimes it's not just national lobbies, but international or global or foreign lobbies, right? I mean, this has become quite the topic lately. So it's a mess any way you look at it. And again, getting back to the heroic Mercy Otis Warren, did she marry Dr. Joseph Warren?
No, man. No, she married the colonial governor. Joseph Warren died at the first battle of Bunker Hill. I forgot what her husband's name was, but he was also Warren, and he served as the governor for a time. Man, that's escaping me, but I forgot. John Warren, I think.
Okay, but Dr. Joseph Warren is another historical figure we should, right? Your Americans act like it, I think, is what he remember from the stock from which you sprang. He said, wasn't he the person that said that?
I can't answer that, but he was one of the few most ardent and radical colonial leaders in Boston, along with Sam Adams and John Hancock. He essentially was really one of the first big names to be martyred for the cause of independence at Bunker Hill. But he was responsible for helping the coalition, organizing the boycotts with the Sons of Liberty, formerly the Loyal Nine and Sam Adams. And he also helped author the Suffolk Resolves, which kind of bound, many of the counties in colonial Massachusetts together against this cause, which was really a cause for disarmament. When you think about what Gage was ordering, he was ordering, the Redcoats to go to Lexington and Concord, ultimately in a gunpowder store near Concord, and take the armaments, which was gunpowder back then. And then the colonialists were rising against that.
So we could look at privacy, gun rights as two very important areas of contention, along with this idea that and then there was the Stamp Act, right? Which was, as Michael Bolden and 10th Amendment senators say, well, the Stamp Act was actually nullified. And then after that, we got the coercive acts, where the king and the parliament said they would have control over anything whatsoever. And then the American people said no, or the British Americans at the time said, no, we're not putting up with that. And that was the kind of like the final spark. Is that essentially how that worked out, Dave?
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of important things. So the Stamp Act is probably the most grand of America's original nullification campaigns. So for the first time, to pay for the French and Indian War, we would know as the French and Indian War, but they called the 7 Years' War in Great Britain, they were going to impose for the first time on the American colonies direct taxes by distributing tax paper and putting it on legal items, documents, things like that. And what you had was a concerted nullification campaign, not centrally managed, but actually operated in various forms of nullification in various colonies. We mostly only hear about what happened in Boston, but there was really a lot of what came to be known as tea parties or nullification campaigns. In some places like Philadelphia, you had the intimidation tactics used against the agents of the crown to ship the stamp paper back. I believe in South Carolina, you had the vessels set fire to make sure that this law couldn't be enforced. What this was a perversion of the basic rights of Englishmen. That's what its opponents were saying. That's what Sam Adams was saying in Boston. Christopher Gadsden was saying in South Carolina. Charles Thompson was saying in Philadelphia. And ultimately, it became way too untenable for the British to be able to enforce. And then you had British merchants complaining about how this affected them as well. So like you said, Dennis, Parliament reversed this. They essentially repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but they replaced it with the Declaratory Act. And that said, it reasserted their ability, their supposed lawful and constitutional ability to bind the colonies in, quote, all cases whatsoever. So what they were saying was, even though that we were repealing this law, we still hold the power to bind the colonies to all of our tax schemes, whatever they are. And they did replace that with things like the Townshend Acts. Later, you got the Intolerable Acts, otherwise known as the Coercive Acts. But that is showing that a concerted system of various nullification schemes within the states actually pushed back against the central authority, which was in London at that time, not in Washington, D.C., and made it so impossible to enforce so as to render it negligible.
Wow. What do you think about that, Glenn?
That's a little bit more than I had in terms of a background. So, yeah, thank you for the debrief, because that's the kind of education you don't hear anymore, or the details of you just don't get.
Well, and Dave does a lot of great work along those lines. He's written books. In fact, he has one, I think, that's particularly pertinent for tonight's discussion about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, A Lifetime of Radicalism. And so we might look at that and say, for all of us who want to live in a free society and who cherish the values of the Declaration of Independence, maybe radicalism should be the thing that we look to, getting to the root of the problem, striking at the root. And Dave might tell us a little bit about Thomas Paine and how he did that, and what Dave's thoughts are on that.
Oh, man, where to even start on this? Thomas Paine, the radical who altered the political systems of probably the three most influential countries of his time, France, Britain, and the United States. He was a radical, but not in the pejorative. I mean, you hear that word used negatively so often, but what radical really meant is it comes from the root word of a Latin word that means to strike at a root. So the radicals were those that believed not in trying to reform the system to make it, more acceptable, but still allow for the violation of rights, but actually to confront at its source the violation of rights and remove them. He wrote Common Sense in the United States, the fledgling United States, but right before, on the eve of them becoming the United States in late 1775, a pamphlet called Common Sense, anonymously at first, said that there's no feasible way to be governed by an outside entity. The United States must be as such, and not as colonial, carve-outs of the British Empire. They should forge their own constitutional system, that the English government was unauthoritative. It stemmed from a bastard brat from Normandy, that was William the Conqueror, and they had no legal authority over these United States, as he wanted them to be called. They weren't called that yet, but his pamphlet caught fire with the American patriots, with people like George Washington and Charles Lee. A lot of people thought that the actual author of this was John Adams or Benjamin Franklin, and it captivated not only the political elite and people that were kind of sympathetic to the argument of secession from Great Britain, but also common people. He brought this down into a language that common people could understand and accept. He used a form of language called vulgarity, which meant essentially colloquialisms that we might expect to see at like a construction site rather than, in the halls of academia. He made these things accessible to regular people and won regular people over to the cause of the Patriots. And that's something that was so instrumental. Without that, I don't think you could have gotten a successful American Revolution. But of course, that's only scratching the surface of what Paine did. He was sentenced to death for seditious libel, for publishing the second part of the Rights of Man. He was a revolutionary that actually was allowed to serve in the provisional government in France, almost killed by hanging by the Jacobins, actually not by hanging, but by the guillotine. And he eventually escaped that fate. I detail all that stuff in my book, but he's certainly a figure worthy of study.
Dave, where can we find your book? Did he hear me?
I don't think so.
Nope.
Jeremy was asking where we can find your book, Dave.
I don't hear audio now.
Oh, his audio went out.
Oh.
He doesn't hear us.
Did we click on something?
I can hear now.
You hear us
Now I
now?
can hear it now?
Yeah.
Are you good?
Okay.
Yeah,
all
he
right.
hears us.
I was just asking real quick, Dave, where can we find your book? Amazon, someplace like that, or you have your own website?
Sure. For my books, davidbenner.square.site. You can buy my books there. You can get them on Amazon too, but if you get them at davidbenner.square.site, I can sign them for you if you'd like to. So I appreciate that.
Well, that's right. Now, and we're talking about some of these great heroes and how the gestation period, of course, it even goes back farther than we've been talking about, because I know that we have a shared admiration for a man who literally gave his head for liberty. He lost his head for liberty, Algernon Sidney.
Mm.
And Dave, could you explain to folks Algernon Sidney's sacrifice and the great things he did in inspiring John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and others?
Yeah, Algernon Sidney is one of those figures you don't hear about, but he was considered, one of the best purveyors of the ideas that the American patriots rallied behind. Much like John Locke, he believed that government is illegitimate when it does anything beyond protecting life, liberty, and property. And Locke famously wrote that sort of thing in his two treatises of civil government. But Algernon Sidney wrote a discourses that came out roughly around the same time, and he was a deep opponent of authoritarian government as it was used in his own time in the 17th century by Charles Stuart and others. And he actually got involved in a assassination plot against the king, the restored monarch after the Cromwellian interregnum, and he lost his head for that. But his ideas and him articulating that in the discourses were extremely influential on America's founding generation. You had the most knowledgeable American patriots read from both Locke and Sidney as if that was the American gospel. Something that had been rejected for the most part in England became at the forefront of the political ideology of the founding generation here.
Wow, and didn't Jefferson say that Sidney's work he thought was the best he'd ever read regarding government? I mean, that's really quite an accolade.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Jefferson always said that the three greatest people that ever lived were Locke, Isaac Newton, and Francis Bacon. But he had almost the same admiration for Sidney, and that sounds right, Dennis.
Okay, so here's another thing to think about. As we look at the Declaration of Independence and what they said and everything they went through, and then we see this, then eventually the Articles of Confederation, and after winning the fight with the British. So, of course, didn't Adams say the real revolution was not the warfare with the British, but it was the changing of the thoughts and the attitudes of the American people before that, right?
He certainly did say that. He said that the revolution was more of a revolution of the thoughts and the minds of the people, and that had become clear to him in reflecting upon this. I think he wrote that much later, but that was what he said. And, going back to Thomas Paine, he said that, and not liking Thomas Paine, actually, John Adams didn't like Thomas Paine at all. He said without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington, would have been raised in vain. And he also said that he can't think of a person in his generation that had more of an impact on the political unfolding of the United States and his time's political theories. He said, call it then the age of Paine. And again, this is a diehard opponent of Paine. You know, John Adams would be what we would have called back then more of a conservative, more leaning toward, you know, a British oriented system compared to someone like Paine or Jefferson. But he acknowledged that. And I think that's exactly right. That was what a lot of people conceived of the revolution as being, including Paine, and he thought that this was a universally applicable thing that should be embraced by other countries. Now, right now, I would say if you're a United States citizen and heeding the best words of Washington and Jefferson to avoid entangling alliances and not get involved in the rest of the world, we shouldn't devote our treasury for that. But he thought that liberty and, you know, Republican government was the gift to mankind from the Creator, and it wasn't something that should just be isolated to one people or one place.
Right. And Sidney wrote, I believe, that it wasn't just the right, but the duty of people to overthrow tyrannical or arbitrary government. I think that's also in the Declaration, isn't it? Which Judge Napolitano, I think, says is the #1 item in the United States Code. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that the first Congress, through organic law, incorporated the Declaration of Independence into its organic law, and I think that's what he's referring to. But absolutely, that is what Sidney wrote, and it's hard to articulate what a radical concept that was at the time, because, like I said, Thomas Paine, and this is almost 130 years after that, he was sentenced to death for publishing The Rights of Man, which called for the same thing in the British system, the ability to alter or abolish one's government. It's not something that the Tories accepted whatsoever out of their constitutional system, and something that, for instance, Edmund Burke, the intellectual old Whig in London, argued profusely against. So for Algernon Sidney to say that back in the 1680s, and Locke to have, you know, various political affinities of that kind, it was incredibly radical. It's something that you could be put to death for. Just think of that. And it looks like they dropped off, but that's all right. So, yeah, Sidney was incredibly influential, just like John Locke to the founding fathers. And it looks like we're back.
Yes, sir.
Yes, we are. Sorry, we missed you just for a few seconds there, but
I don't hear audio, though.
Oh, he's not hearing us now. Hello.
I don't hear any audio.
okay,
He's not hearing audio.
working on it. And
Now I do.
hold on.
Oh,
Good,
Now I
good,
do.
good.
It just swapped out for some reason.
I have a quick
Okay.
question for you, Dave. During all of this talk amongst the those that were developing this country and kind of developing the system of government, how popular were all of these ideas with the general populace? I mean, were the citizens actively aware of some of these thoughts, concepts, arguments, some of the discussions that went on at this time with all of these names that we're talking about? Or was it confined to a more top level group, and the country just kind of came on board later because it was supposedly the thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I will say it was rare for the average American citizen to have like a deep understanding of history and political theory that stretched up to the level that American oligarchs and the American political elite were generally talking about. Now, that's not exclusively true because, for instance, Paine, he was a commoner. He wasn't part of the political elite whatsoever. In some ways, he was the antithesis of that. but it was through Paine and people like that, the pamphleteers of the time, that got those debates, those messages, those ideas down to the populace and made them palatable. So I think I'd veer more toward the second, scenario you unfolded there. It was articulated down to the masses, not an innate educational understanding. But the political elite of the time was very well versed in this, not only in English history, but especially Roman history. And there's so many different things about the founding fathers that they just saw the world through Roman and English eyes. They look back to all these constitutional antecedents and political events that really shaped their mindsets because of the education they had in those two areas, especially something that, most Americans do unfortunately lack today, I think.
Yeah. So Dave, as we look at this transitional phase or the passage of time between, let's say, the Declaration and the other documents that preceded it, and then the Revolutionary War, then the Articles, and then going to the Constitution, there might be some changes in emphasis or some differences. And some people have pointed out that, again, this idea of the duty and or the right and the duty to overthrow tyrannical and arbitrary government in the Declaration is not what we see in the Constitution, where it talks about calling up militia to suppress insurrection and rebellion and that sort of thing. So how significant of a change is that?
Well, there wasn't a change in the form of rendering it impossible to alter or abolish the government. I mean, those who signed the Constitution were Lockeans. I mean, there were some people that disliked Locke maybe a little bit more than others, but they looked at Locke's words, Sidney's words, as particular political gospel. And the Constitution is written in a way that, a subset of powers were delegated from the states to the central government. Most of them are articulated in Article 1, Section 8, but there is one section of the Constitution that prohibits the state from doing certain things, and that's Article 1, Section 10. And among those things are things like imposing ex post facto law, coining anything for legal tender but gold and silver. Of course, that's been perverted by the Fed and all the central banks, but nowhere in that place in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, is there any prohibitions for the states to secede. The 10th Amendment, for instance, was passed. That's what Jefferson called the foundation of the federal Constitution in a 1790 argument against the central bank. He called the 10th Amendment the foundation of the federal Constitution. It says that all powers not delegated to the central government are to be held by the states or people. So there's nothing that says that altering or abolishing the government is prohibited. Now, we can make an argument as to whether that is wise or fruitful, or we should be advocating for that currently. But in terms of morality and politically, the founding generation was one that thought that was moral, that when a state overstepped its own authority, violated the rights of the people, and were doing anything but bringing about the public tranquility that the preamble called for, it was ultimately the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. That is what Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. And the last thing I want to mention on this is that 3 states, Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, all passed within their ratification ordinances explicit guarantees that when the general government had overstepped its authority, those 3 states would, quote, resume the sovereign powers that they had delegated to the central authority. This was a way, before the term really existed in common use, secession, to say that, well, when the government is tyrannical, we're going to secede from it. Now, secession is different from a violent revolution to overthrow it, but this is just making clear that there were multiple routes that, the American people thought of to bypass tyranny in its last resort.
Wow. And then you mentioned nullification. And of course, we've studied a lot about that. I know had much discussion about this. Jefferson called it the rightful remedy and the moderate middle ground, right? So that if so, well, we don't want to leave the Union, but or the larger group, but there are things that are being done that are outside the bounds of law and injure our rights. Non-cooperation or interposition, which is what I think Madison called for, could be used to defend the rights of the people from these usurpations of power. And of course, St. George Tucker said taking undelegated authority is a usurpation of power, which he called a treason against the sovereignty of the people. So there was this moderate or in-between step of nullification, which, as you pointed out, the Stamp Act, but then later 1798, that famous situation where Adams tried to control freedom of speech and, interestingly, right, immigration, and then later the Fugitive Slave Acts, and then more recently, I guess there was some nullification of the alcohol prohibition, and even more recently, marijuana prohibition, or some of the attacks on our privacy, and even gold and silver, sound money and that sort of thing. So, could you speak to that as what they discussed back then, how they utilized it, and of course, like I say, the Fugitive Slave Acts, nullifying that, and how it's being used today, and how you might see that as a tool to protect liberty?
Yeah, you did a pretty good gallop through some of the incidents through which nullification was applied. But what happened in 1798 was the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, the most controversial of which was the Sedition Act, and it called for fines and imprisonment, fines of up to $2,000, which today is something like $90,000 or $100,000 in today's money, if someone was to literally criticize the president. And there were crackdowns on this. It's so hard to imagine this because you open up a browser, open up a tab in YouTube, and see people critiquing the government all the time. But the fierce critics of the Adams administration, the most prominent among them, people like James Callender and other famous polemicists and political agitators, were literally arrested and jailed, literally for just criticizing the Adams administration. And people in Virginia especially were saying that, well, this is called to secede. William Giles, who later became the state governor of Virginia, said we essentially should secede over this. John Taylor of Caroline, one of Thomas Jefferson's best friends, said, in correspondence to Jefferson, what do you think we should do? It seems to me that we should sever ties with this union. And Jefferson rightly called it a reign of witches, but his solution was to apply some of those same principles that the American revolutionaries applied during the Stamp Act, to actually draft up resolutions and refuse to cooperate with the feds. And not only a refusal to cooperate, to actively use state resources to push against the feds for exerting unconstitutional or immoral perversions of liberty within the states, sending the federal marshals to do that. And what you did have was the reign of witches did find an end. The Sedition Act was not renewed, and Jefferson walked into office pardoning every last person that was jailed for the Sedition Act. But that is a situation that we should learn from today and apply to all the federal violations of our liberty, all the federal encroachments on the states and local governments. Because, and the last thing I'll say on this too, Dennis, is I think you pointed this out so perfect, that today, you think of legal scholars and academia and people in the mainstream media. They always say that nullification is so radical. That's such an extremist idea. But back then, like you mentioned, it was portrayed as the moderate middle ground between refusing to suffer these violations of liberty and just leaving the union because of it, and on the other hand, just accepting these as something that you just have to deal with and wait till the next election to vote the bums out. It really was a moderate middle ground, and it's served a lot of purpose in the early American Republic. Of course, not as much knowledge is given to this subject today, but I think it's better than, say, 20 years with places like the 10th Amendment Center and other places talking about it.
Dave, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
How much would you contrast or lay down the difference between what you're describing right now as this fierce spirit of sovereignty, independence, however we want to quantify that exact idea and concept of what you're talking about, but these states are ready to just cut ties at a moment's notice. And as you started off at the beginning of the show talking about the Declaration of Independence, really wasn't a founding document. It was a severance document. It was a cutting of ties, as it even says in the preamble there. But taking that and then looking at the fierceness of not only what we face today, but even the Civil War, and Lincoln famously saying, I care not about freeing the slaves as long as we preserve the Union. There's other people who talked about, I'm paraphrasing a little bit there, but that was his essence. And a lot of that suspension of that concept or idea of being sovereign. I don't want to use that term too much because of the sovereign citizen movements and how that's been bastardized, but just that overwhelming idea, what you're describing right now in the colonies and then the first states, of how absolutely independent, fiercely independent, where you just said middle of the road. And I'm contrasting that today with the extreme overreach of the federal government controlling every area of our lives, and how far we've deviated in 250 years. I just kind of want you to dive into a little bit more of that difference and give us more of that contrast.
Yeah, I mean, the deviations can't be, understated. The deviations between that theory where this union existed not as a national centralized government, but by a union of states, a league of states of sorts. I wrote a book on this called Compact of the Republic, because the United States in its original conception was supposed to be a compact. And what is a compact? Well, you think of a contract, and that's just a voluntary arrangement between individuals, but a compact is like that among sovereign governments. So what you had was the states actually built the federal government. The states had to precede the federal government, not the other way around, which leaves you to believe that, hey, this structure that they created based on delegated powers should have put the states at the top when it came to, who was the ultimate authority behind this union. Now, that's been perverted so much through time. You can put it at several junctures. I do think 1865 was one of the big ones, but also times like the 1913, progressive revolution, where we get the IRS, the Fed, and the 17th Amendment, consolidating things even more into a nationalized entity. Then you had the New Deal to do that to a further level. Then you had the Great Society to do that to the other level. Then you get the real explosion of the American Empire, the War on Terror, the surveillance state, the security state under the DHS and the Patriot Act. All these things are movements toward the consolidation of power, such that now you see, civil wars essentially play out in the American states every 2 or 4 years over who's going to rule us and whether they'll be on flavor blue or flavor red. It's just such a difference when it came to contrast with the founding era, where the states were supposed to be the most pivotal pillars of the American Republic. And most people didn't care quite as much about who the president was unless they unleashed like a national policy that was, super destructive. Like, say, I'm a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson, but I think the Embargo Act in his second term was his greatest injustice. That's when the citizens really cared about who was president. Before that, most of your life, you'd never encounter federal agents, and it would be much more substantial, the changes in your state or local governments comparatively. So I guess to grandly answer your question in a long-winded way, the deviation has been just complete, just about totally complete. Now, we do have state lines where, some laws, some different policies break down, but it has been a more, fierce trajectory to nationalization than at any other time in history, especially in the last 100 years.
And just a quick follow-up on that, Dave, too, as well. When you're talking about this, I look at, you just said it about the president, and I want to follow up on that real quick. I'm continually trying to push people now to recognize that all politics is local. We're screaming about a national senator from our state, when the reality is we need to deal with the out of touch or out of control school superintendent in our local community, because that's more tangible. You think that a senator is going to come down and try to enforce the bill that he passed on the national stage about boys being able to go into little girls' bathrooms? No, if we take control of those school boards, we take control of that superintendent, either fire him or get him out of there, and we have control of the school boards, and we have control of our commissioners, we have control of that local politics. And what you just said about the president being, most people really didn't care, because it only was these few areas that were affected by that leadership. The rest of it was very tangible. It was very personal to these communities. It had a much more grassroots understanding or grassroots application of liberty, of sovereignty, of it, and then it translated up into the wings of government, versus it now coming down from these orators that are trying to control and just dominate us from on high. Think of just address that for a minute too, because I love the way you broke that down, but I want to flesh it out just a little bit more for the people out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Think and act locally. You have so much more of a difference thinking and acting locally politically. I'm not even that big of a political individual. I think my role in this whole thing is to educate and to talk about the issues, try to inspire people. But every movement does need local organizers. They need people pushing better messages and more virtuous messages, more foundational messages when it comes to the early republic and some of the ideals of the founders on a local level. And like you said, the school boards are really important. Sheriffs are really important. City council, super important. County commissioner, very, very important. And if you think you'll have any sway over federal senators, let alone congressmen at this time, I think it's almost a pipe dream for just about everyone. Now, some people do have considerable sway, but it ultimately often comes in the form of large monetary payments through the lobbies that do get attached to the national legislators. But I can tell you, I have swayed the opinions on local legislators in multiple states that I've lived in just by talking to them about these issues. And it's not just me thinking that, it's actually watching how their votes unfold after we talk. And if you think that you can have that kind of sway on national legislators, on senators, it's too unimaginable at this point. You can't really change Washington from the inside, but man, you can do a lot of change if your activism is focused, harnessed, and fiery in defense of your state or locality in those kinds of races. I do think that is the case.
Amen. Gentlemen?
Huge. Just being on a school board, Dave, I can tell you that, in terms of having voter power, in terms of having a voice, when I ran for school board in my area in 2022, I ran with a few other folks, and we kind of ran it as a slate, and there was a field of 9 candidates with 4 that were going to be elected to the school board. And in those 9 candidates, out of, I believe, about, it was over 20,000 votes, 2 of those candidates tied the exact number of votes in a field of 9, actually tied, got the same number. We went through our recall process, found out that many of us got even more votes, and the gentleman that I ran with easily won his contest. But the power in terms of local voting and being engaged locally has such a tremendous impact that a lot of people lose sight. They think the big picture, they think the president, they think the governor, they think like you were talking about, the senator and so on. It really is important to get that word out that yes, your local vote is going to weigh heavily, far more heavily than on a big national scale, and you're going to have a voice. And I think we've really lost that, and just trying to get people motivated, that's the issue. And I think education, like the kind you're putting out, talking about our system of government, talking about what some of the founders and principles of creating this country that we now live in, those fundamental things that they believed are absolutely crucial to get back to and educate the average voter with. So I applaud you in writing books that you are and what you've done so far. And good job on what you've given us so far.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Glenn. I appreciate it. And thanks for the time you put into your community, man, because I'm guilty of this too. I am looking at the national issues for what I talk about in the content that I make and make a living on. But when it comes to how much, influence you have, it is on the local level. And I think it behooves us to say that even if we are captivated by the national issues, I am one of those people that are, but we actually have to not lose, we have to see the forest for the trees in this whole situation and see where we can make the most impact and apply our labor that way. And I think that's most effective.
So, Dave, if we tie it together in with what we talked about earlier with the nullification efforts, I'm wondering about your thoughts in terms of people trying to nullify the surveillance state, the flock and Axon cameras being the most recent thing. And sometimes people like with data centers, they're quite concerned about those too. Sometimes just because of the corporate welfare involved, I guess, with some of those. But then also on the war side of things, and I'm thinking of our mutual friend the heroic Sergeant Dan McKnight and the work he's doing with Defend the Guard. And could you please share with us some of your thoughts on working locally for some of these nullification efforts, or maybe we'd call them constitutional law enforcement, and overcoming some of the objections that we frequently get? And I think we really know I guess in both cases it has to do with, alleged security and safety and that sort of thing. But then on the Defend the Guard, maybe there might be another objection that comes up to it. Financially, some people say, Dan says that's a scare tactic. But what are your thoughts on those two topics and other areas for localized nullification efforts?
Yeah, well, let's talk Defend the Guard. In some ways, it's not really nullification, because all Defend the Guard says is, from a state level, feds follow the Constitution in declaring these wars before you wage them. Otherwise, you can't have access to our reserve forces. In some ways, it's just follow the Constitution or else. It's the most, no-brainer that you can possibly imagine. Of course, all the lobbies, the bomb makers, the military-industrial complex throws everything to defeat those efforts, but that's what Defend the Guard is. And yeah, Daniel McAdams and Daniel McKnight, for that matter, are both heroes in pushing these things. And that is a way that you can actually, it seems so overwhelming, right? We look at the American empire, we look at the latest regime change war for Israel, and then we look at dumping resources into the coffers of Zelensky. Wherever you break down, you can find a lot of Americans that are at least against one of those excesses. Usually it depends on who's in office at the time that person, if they are a partisan, has those ideas or not. But this is a way to remain consistent in a non-interventionist, Ron Paul embracing mentality, where our states, we should use the military to defend the states. Imagine that, not extend the American empire into the Middle East and Eastern Europe and the Pacific, as many especially right-wingers want to do, failing to learn the lessons from the proxy war against Russia. They are not all having principled objectives to that war for that purpose, but they want to shift those resources into the Pacific. Well, this is a way to shut the door on all of that, but not through Washington, through a local level, and getting the states in line, educating legislators and getting them knowledgeable on these issues to stand up against the feds and say enough is enough. Because imagine that. If a state really stood up to this the way that Virginia and Kentucky stood up against the Alien and Sedition Acts, I do think we could put a dent in the armor of the American war machine.
Well, yes, that certainly makes sense. That's a wonderful description of what's going on there. And perhaps seeing that's why the opposition to the Defend the Guard, which is, again, is constitutional law enforcement, and so any oath taker should be in favor of it, why there's such hysterical and overwrought opposition to it from people who don't want the Constitution followed and were the oath breakers. And then, again, the privacy issues, and also sound money with the Sound Money Defense League and the work that they're doing. So there are some hopeful things that are taking place. And I just wanted to mention, and we're talking about working locally and on elections, but also didn't Madison, in the Federalist Papers, was it Federalist 46, where he went through the steps to fight against usurpation and tyranny, and voting was fourth, but he had some other things like non-cooperation with the officers of the Union and the frown of the magistrate and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Federalist 46. It's probably my favorite of the entire series. And there you had Madison responding to some of the biggest and most persuasive arguments of the anti-federalists in opposing this Constitution. And one of them was, they said, well, this federal government is going to run roughshod over the states. They'll violate the powers that the states have, encroach upon them by going beyond the bounds of what Article 1, Section 8, those delegated powers said. And Madison was saying, well, if that happens, if they pass laws that are unconstitutional, that they go beyond the bounds prescribed in Article Section 8, the states can, quote, create obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to endure. And Madison goes on to qualify this and say that this doesn't just go for unconstitutional laws, it goes for immoral laws as well, that the states would stand up, void those laws, and in fact nullify them against the interests of the perverted federal government. And look at how many perversions there are in the federal government now, whether it be the surveillance state, running roughshod over the Fourth Amendment. We have the war machine. We have all sorts of absurd regulations and encroachments on individual liberties. We saw the wave of totalitarianism on the American doorstep during the COVID lockdowns. It's just abhorrent. It's the ultimate violation of liberty on both the federal and the state levels, if you ask me. And yet a lot of people don't know these ideas, and I think it behooves us to spread them as much as we can.
What concerns me about that, Dave, we have this incredible history of not following the Constitution, not following some of the requirements that were originally laid out. I'm trying to think of something that hasn't been violated, and because of that lengthy list that we have, how relevant are we going to make the Constitution in the future? That's a big concern of mine. We've done so much to alter it, change it, go against it. Stomp on it, yeah. And are we going to feel the heat of all of this precedent of what we've done so far when we try to, let's say, reclaim or try to get back to those initial principles of what this country was founded on? It seems like an incredibly uphill battle that almost seems insurmountable. And I don't want to be a fatalist here, but it's something that really concerns me.
Yeah, it concerns me too. I think we're already feeling the ramifications of that with a centralized government, with the American empire, the welfare state that's just unsustainable, untenable. We're $40 trillion in debt right now. The Fed printed something like 50% of the currency that exists now in the last 5 years. It's absurd in so many ways. The feds, whether they be Democratic or Republican feds, have essentially rendered the Constitution into a dead letter. And, what Jefferson said about this in the founding period was he knew that the United States was forging a republic. That was the government we were supposed to have. Benjamin Franklin said famously, we have a Republican government if you can keep it. We have a republic if you can keep it. But Jefferson said that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Now, he said that knowing that would happen in a Republican government too. That is what happened in the Roman Empire. I should say the Roman Republic up to the ascension of Augustus. That happens in republics just as it has in kingdoms. And I just don't think the solution is found within reforming the central government. It is arming the people with the right ideas to think and act locally. And I think we're feeling the ramifications of that, but I don't have the ultimate solution for how to bring the populace back to that. If you're looking at the American Republic on a spectrum of time, I think we're beyond the empire stage of, say, Augustus and Nero. I think we're in the Domitian stage of the Roman Empire of sorts when relating that to the American government. And that's to say that I think we're so far removed from those original foundations that it's a dead letter that's trampled upon. There's no argument less persuasive in Washington, D.C. today than this is unconstitutional or immoral. Those are the least prominent arguments made. And that's something that Ron Paul put in one of his books, so I like to repeat that.
Dave, would you see value, or what value would you see in looking to our state constitutions? Would that be something that would make sense in terms of what we've been discussing tonight?
Well, I mean, when it comes to constitutional government was the alternative that the founders had compared to plenary government, government that had superlative authority to legislate and act on essentially anything else. So if you're telling me, would you rather have an arbitrary government like that technically has all the legal powers to do anything, or a Republican system that, even if violated, does spell out the confines of where government should be? I'd choose the latter every time. Of course, local governments pervert the state constitutions all the time too. So a constitution, just like any other contract, is only as good as the people that enforce it, or the way in which it's enforced, to make sure that the authorities are reined in, that they have to stay within those confines. And ultimately, the American people haven't been able to do that very well. But again, the American people have much more wherewithal and much more influence to alter their constitutions on a local level. That's what federalism was supposed to be for, that the state constitutions actually mattered a heck of a lot, and that you'd have, an individual sorting process by which people could choose where they want to live by what's preferable to them, which legal system that they want to live under, which government with which constitution do they want to operate under. But going down to the individual levels, I'll support constitutions, even if you bring it to like an individual contract level. I think that consent moralizes things much more so than stuff like majority rule votes in Congress. So if we can get down to the individual level and consensual action the way we do on other things, I think that'd be beneficial. So yeah, I think the state constitutions are important, but I'd bring it all the way down to individual level with contracts, and that should dictate what's right or wrong, not who can outnumber who in a majority rule vote.
Okay, so sometimes you hear this phrase or this terminology, anarcho-capitalism. Is that what we're looking at here? Self-government, but as Sheldon Richman said, I think today, when he speaks of self-government, he's thinking of actual selves, individuals, and not collectives, and that sort of thing. That seems to be what you're referring to.
To me, that's the ideal, but I express those ideals under the full knowledge that that's not where the American people are. And if I think those ideals were ever to thrive, it wouldn't be like on a national level where the entire U.S. government embraces like this anarcho-capitalist theory where we all get into, these contracts that all 330 million people sign and live under. I don't think that's true. I think what would be more likely, and again, this is getting a little bit theoretical, would be covenant communities, as Hans Hermann Hoppe talked about, where maybe a community of 500 people enter into this cloistered area, at some point, whether it be, seasteading or somewhere else to, run their government in a voluntary fashion, such that there's never any monopoly on violence, which really does characterize the state. Now, again, I don't think the American people are there on that, but being closer to that is where I want to move, the populace and move the politics, regardless of where you stand on that diaphragm, from constitutional conservative or whatever you want to call to anarcho-capitalism. And I think that moving toward giving the individual more wherewithal and more utility and, more powers is a better thing all the way down to the individual level. But again, some of this stuff gets theoretical, and I don't see it, overtaking the U.S. anytime soon.
How long, Dave, do you think we actually have? Do you think because as you're talking about it, the theory, Glenn's question, and then Dennis, and then the follow-up question, as you answered all that, we've brought up the subject a number of times on the show, talking about when do you think balkanization happens? When do you think that 3 or 4 states over here band together and say, we've had enough, and they do conceptually what you're talking about from, at least a state level or even a county level. We know that there are movements that have been largely theoretical, but now have gained a lot of traction, where Oregon, the eastern side of Oregon on the other side of the mountains, wants to secede and join Wyoming or Idaho.
Yeah.
We know there's been talk for years of California breaking into up to 5 different states.
Yeah.
And they've been theoretical at times, but even Texas breaking. These are gaining prominence. These are gaining true discussions in the halls of the state congresses, and certainly on the public square. So when you're talking about this, it's very. Going back to Glenn's question, it's like we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. They've written, the minute that they looked at the Bill of Rights and they said, we're going to violate this exact bill that said you have no right to violate this. There's a cascade at that point. There's an avalanche of, as you pointed out, Jefferson saying, liberty, and then government's going to increase. Liberty is going to fade, and then government's going to increase. So do you see that in a theoretical thing? I'm looking at, anywhere from 20 to 50 years, we're balkanized here in this country, and we're breaking up in states, and it could accelerate depending on, the $40 trillion can become quite a bit of a motivator for people to break free from that type of debt system. Plus, I just saw today, I saw a little graphic, and I went through the graphic of how many guns per 100 people are in the world. And I think I think it came back at 250 guns per 100 people in America, and the next country below us was like 36 or something like that. And I go, you've got that amount of weaponry in this country. Balkanization seems to be a much more tangible, a much closer future, because I don't see how we do recover even the totality of a single state government, let alone the federal government, without going through an absolute severing of ties once again and a reestablishment of a pure foundation, because you're not going to repeal all this garbage they've passed. What do you think of that, Dave?
Oh man, I kind of go back and forth on this question because, man, as far as like individual efforts of non-cooperation, non-compliance, quasi-nullification against the feds, I think those things are going to be prevalent as ever, especially in, marijuana prohibition. The feds maintain that marijuana is illegal. Yeah. The states don't recognize it, and you're seeing real pushback there. But when it comes to balkanization, I'm not sure that I see it anytime in the near future. And I think it comes down to a few reasons. So number one, America today is not really divided that much on state lines the way it was, say, in the mid-19th century, geographically, in sectional conflict. Right. Is more of a rural urban divide. And you could say, hey, maybe the states could break apart and form multiple states. You mentioned, potential Cal exit or balkanizing that into 5 states. The state of Jefferson has been proposed in that sort of arrangement. But some of these efforts are so politicized, where you do have true believers. Like, I know people that run the Texit movement, like Daniel Miller. He's a hero that applies the same principles no matter who's in office. But when a lot of these movements catch fire, some of the activist based is, only fired up when the guy they don't like it is in the Oval Office. And I think that works against it. I also think that, there hasn't really been partitions of states, I think, since 1863, when Lincoln, in my mind, and in his own attorney general's mind, by the way, unconstitutionally created a new state, the state of West Virginia, out of Virginia, even though the Richmond government, as it says in Article 4 of the Constitution, that the original legislature has to consent to the partition, even if you're going under Lincoln's impression that the southern states never actually seceded. He did that in 1863. So here we're left like 160 years later and change, never having done that. So those things, and then just seeing like the COVID tyranny come down, I think the most totalitarian measures in my entire lifetime. You literally had religious worship restrictions, closure of businesses, forcing old people to die alone. You had lack of assembly rights, shutting down arbitrarily businesses and prohibiting people from going about their daily lives. Some people had to wait until see what the governor would say as to whether they could leave their own front door that day. And we just did not have pushback over that. So I guess I hate to be a cynic. I just don't think we're in a state where the populace is willing to do that, despite how heavily armed that the country is. And indeed, per capita, the U.S. has by far the most guns. I think there's something like, there's like 500 million guns in the U.S. now. But when that projection has unfolded, where more and more guns are acquired, we actually have more and more tyranny too. I hate to say it. I think that I think that Washington politicians are the best gun salesmen, but I don't think that that's leading to like tangible, conflicts within the states. So I'm a little bit cynical on seeing that in the near future, but I do go back and forth on it.
Well, and I see that too with the idea of when you brought that up, immediately it clicked in my head. I'm like, you're right. We don't have that. We have more allegiances to our football teams and baseball teams and college teams than we do to our state. We'll say I'm from X state, but we don't have that. I mean, when you go back to the founding fathers, they were Virginians, or they were from Massachusetts, or they were staunch. They were much more. They had a fervor for their state that far exceeds any true patriots today for their fervor for America in general. And it just, wearing a flag shirt, it's
was their identity.
It was their identity, was their state, not the nation as a whole. And so I agree with you. That's a great assessment, because I wasn't thinking about that to break up into these, to balkanization on that level, you would have to have a resurgence of either a state or county ideology or identity that would rise up as a coalition there to then break away. So I see that. Dennis, you had a question next.
Well, I was going to say just a couple things along these lines. Is it maybe that, well, we're looking at the so-called K-shaped, or some people even call it an I-shaped economy, that this is going to continue to intensify.
Mm-hmm.
And if the number of people that see themselves as being on the outs, being have-nots, relatively speaking, and see their situation having diminished significantly for several reasons. One large part of this being currency depreciation because of the Federal Reserve and the monetary inflation, the overspending by government being monetized by the Fed, and that sort of thing. That could lead more and more, particularly if things get, and now some people are very concerned about what could happen with a lot of our infrastructure systems, having underinvestment there, underinvestment in natural resources, and with what's happening overseas, with what Trump's doing, and others have done, Iran, Ukraine, Russia, and that sort of thing, that there could be all sorts of things that could put pressure on our basic necessities for daily living.
Yeah.
And that could push people in a certain direction for this, where there might be some places that might say, we're more self-sufficient than these other areas, and we don't want them to take from us. There might be some states that could feel, and it might also be potentially, maybe it's going to turn out to be generational, because if you look at the, it's not just the $40 trillion in debt, it's the unfunded contingent liabilities,
yes,
which are well over $100 trillion, and the math doesn't math, and they say you can't vote your way out of it and that sort of thing.
right.
So some of the great thinkers, men like Rick Rule and others who have followed this for a long time, say, well, we know what's likely to happen. I mean, John Polomny of Actionable Intelligence Alerts, another person that points this out. The politicians are not going to voluntarily say, yeah, I guess you guys were right. Let's get rid of the Fed. Let's cut down on spending. I mean, for one thing, there's so much leverage and things. I mean, the implosion would be horrific.
Yeah.
But if they don't do it, then the other side is going to be horrific too. So the idea would be they're just going to keep spending more and more, creating more and more credit, printing more and more money through debt monetization, that sort of thing. And so people are going to say, yeah, I'm getting my payments, my transfer payments, but they're buying less and less.
Right.
Who knows where that's going to lead? And will the young people at some point say, why is this huge burden on us? There's not enough young people to be able to shoulder this. And they might say, hey, sorry, we'll take care of our family members, but it's every family for themselves now, or every small community for themselves. So maybe there will be something along these lines that we're talking about, but maybe in a different format than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, certainly there's a financial morass, and it does break down to some extent on generational boundaries where young people, like the stat that just stuns me the most in looking into this and reading about it lately, is that the typical home buyer today trying to start a family, buy a home, is 40 years old. 40 years old is the typical home buyer. And I don't know how old you guys are, but several decades ago, it was possible to buy individual homes on 1 or 2 annual incomes. It just was. And that's just a total utopian pipe dream now. And I don't put that on any particular program, though the bludgeoning of the debt through Medicare and Social Security is largely to blame for it. It's this idea that, posterity doesn't matter, and people don't make the connections that every time you outspend your means, which the federal government does at a rate of something like $2 trillion a year right now over budget, that's more steel being forged into proverbial shackles on posterity and children that will grow up with less purchasing power, with more debt, and more inflation. And again, it behooves people that know better to link these things. I mean, right now you hear a lot of the Democratic candidates talking about this. Of course, a lot of the Republicans and Trump won't acknowledge it right now, but there really is an unaffordability crisis. But that's inflation. What is that caused by? It's not caused by corporate greed, despite what Bernie Sanders and people like that will tell you. It's through spending and financing that debt through the currency debasement, through the Federal Reserve. If you can link these things to the everyday miseries that Americans are facing, maybe we'll bring about more of a change. But right now, when it comes to dissonant politics, it seems like our ideas on foreign policy are winning people over, although, of course, not the political class, much more so than our economic policies. And, I think that a lot of this is no one's fault but the people in office. And when Biden was in office, the Trump campaign and people aligned with him smeared Biden, I think rightly so, for saying, well, you're not doing anything about this debt. You're growing government. It's to the detriment of the people. And all you have to say about it is you're just too stupid to realize how good you have it. And now the shoe's on the other foot, and you hear the Trump administration saying that to some extent. Well, both parties are the problem, and neither party reins in spending. So for all the times you hear about limited government conservatism, it's just never delivered. It was actually boasted by Trump and Hegseth that we were going to grow the Pentagon budget up to $1.5 trillion after they smeared Biden for having an $890 billion Pentagon budget. So that's where we're left. I mean, that's my rant for the day. But I hope more people learn the truth about debt financing and the real financial catastrophe that both sides have kind of put us in.
Absolutely. Dave, I want to add, you touched on a couple things that made me think of the homelessness in this country, and specifically thinking about how we went from a country founded, our foundation was all about property. I mean, I've alluded to it that even the founding fathers toyed with the idea of you've corrected me exactly how it was, but life, liberty, and property.
Oh, right.
And but that it was so important to property that they came from a feudal system. They came from lords and kings owning the land to each individual having that that sovereignty of ownership. And we used to use land patents, and we used to have this idea, back when the founding country, the country was founded, if you were homeless, certainly there were beggars and poor people within the cities. But if you didn't have the means, you could go out in the woods and find a place that was not already owned and just stake a claim and build it up. And after so many years, you could file for a land patent. If you had, if nobody had claimed it or kicked you off there and said, we already own this, you could do that. Now you fast forward even through, the Depression eras with the Hoovervilles, where we had whole cities that were occupied by homeless people in these tent cities. And now you look at it, you've got places like New York and LA and Chicago and many of these other places where you have entire hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, in these encampments of homeless people. And we've got property taxes, and I think this is one of the more subtle behind the scenes, but actually when you look at it, huge aspects of the fall of these United States, from an aspect of when you had responsibility, personal responsibility, and property ownership. The Fourth Amendment meant more. The Third Amendment meant more. Even the Second Amendment and the First Amendment, they had far more gravity, far more of an impact because you had ownership. And when we looked at our founding fathers and they said, I'm going to lay down everything that I have. When we know that the revolution, the vast majority of the weapons of warfare for the Revolutionary War at the beginning were from private citizens who had it on their properties to protect their own properties from pirates and raiders and anybody else, and they loaned it to them, or they sold it to them, or rented it to them, whatever the situation was. And then the rest of the weapons that we got were when we started actually conquering the British and seizing things. Like in New York, that one battle in New York was huge. We seized the cash. But just speaking to that a little bit, Dave, about how much that erosion of private property then changes the mindset of people because they don't own anything. And then you hear a Klaus Schwab and some of these other economic forum people talking about how you'll have nothing and you'll be happy. BS. I'm not going to be happy about that. I think my ownership, and it does personify itself in your guns, in your home, in your vehicle, and the right to free travel and these things. And that to me is one of our fundamentals that's been eroded, but it kind of flies under the radar because they did it so incrementally and so slowly that most people, they wake up and they're like, wait, I don't actually own my home. No, they can tax seize it. You paid $500,000 for your house over the last 50 years, but now you're a retiree and your Social Security's not paying for it and your pension's not paying for it. And so, they seized in a tax for $5,000. You were behind $5,000 on your taxes and they came and took your house. Dave, respond to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that private property is the foundation and starting point of any prosperous society. And it's been diminished to such an extent where, property holders in the United States pay a fee to the government every year. Well, if you have to pay a fee to the government every year to hold your property and to continue maintaining that property, is it really yours? And I would answer in the negative. It's not yours to the extent that that tax is levied upon you. And
right.
You look at Locke and some of the people we've been talking about tonight, he believed that acquiring labor in the first part, it was called the labor theory of value, where you mix your labor with natural resources in the first place to create property. But then in the second place, you could trade your property with others. But the government has built so many, just insane stipulations on that, so much regulation on that, so much taxation on that, that we've lost really what it means to be in a private property holding location. To the extent that we see those regulations, that we see those monopolies that keep competitors out of the market against the giants, say in big pharma or big tech or big energy. And it really has diminished what it means to hold property to the extent that I think that you put it there. So I'm right on board with that. We haven't seen, a real property owning populace to the extent that many of the founders envision.
Yeah. And that erodes away from people don't have an understanding of the Third and Fourth Amendments in any true way, shape, or form, and it's also diminished even the Second and the First Amendment because my freedom of speech. What am I going to speak about? Because I'm going to be no, and it's one of my arguments about voting rights. Is they originally set up voting rights as predominantly white landowners because they knew they had a vested interest in the country, and it was their foundation. And once that's eroded, once that's diluted, and that's you no longer have those property rights, then your vote. What am I voting for? You're just gonna get the next. It's the next tax man that he's the same as meet the new boss, the same as the old boss. And you're just continually taking more and more. And Congress basically exists to pass new ways of siphoning money off the populace, and then blowing it on whatever bullshit agenda that they have out there. That's really what's, and people have that. They see it and they go, why even fight back? Why even bother? And that's the demoralization of it. And I just I go, man, we're going to continually have more and more homeless people because I think a lot of them only see siphoning off a system that is raping them at the same time. It's like, you know what? If I'm gonna be raped, then I'm gonna make sure the guy raping me is at least feeding me well and buying me nice clothes later on. And that's sad. That's a horrible way to look at it, but it's become this Stockholm syndrome where we are in love with our abusers and they just keep abusing us more and more and more. What did Jefferson say? The tyranny that you put up, the amount of tyranny that you'll live under is the amount of tyranny that you put up with. Am I paraphrasing that? Dave, you probably can quote it better than me, but
I just don't know that quote, but I agree with that. And I think you're seeing that for sure. So I have nothing to add. I think that's right.
Right. Dennis, next.
Okay. Well, I guess one thing I would say, the way I'd like to maybe put it in an overarching context, is that in the Declaration of Independence, it states that we get our rights from the Almighty, from the Creator. And as Judge Napolitano says, God created us in His image.
Yeah.
He is free, therefore we are free. We have our liberty from God. Why are we putting it up for a vote? Why are we putting it at risk of a popularity contest every 2 and 4 years? Getting back to things that David referenced earlier.
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing, people say voting is the most important thing. I think that's totally wrong for a number of reasons. One of which is they do these man on the street question things and going back. People have no idea what's going on. So, but on top of that, even if they did, no one has the right to take away someone else's liberty, someone else's right to make peaceful, voluntary arrangements and engage in peaceful, voluntary conduct.
Right.
And so, therefore, as we were saying earlier, we have, frankly, the voting has become far too important. There was only supposed to be a very limited amount of democracy involved in this, the American system, and it was supposed to be liberty first with very tight guide rails on the people being elected, being voted on. And Jefferson said, if it's a question of, hey, this guy could administer this constitutional program better than the other guy, then you vote on it. But if not, then you don't turn to voting. You nullify it now. You take action and you punish them for what they have done. But as Dave pointed out, we know that's obviously fallen by the wayside. And there are a number of people, and I mentioned Sheldon Richman, Robert Higgs is another one. I mean, quite a few of the great philosophers of our day who have said, we gave it. It was the experiment. We gave the experiment of constitutionalism.
Right.
It doesn't work. It didn't work, and there are a number of reasons why over a long period of time it won't. And many of the revolutionary patriots, and including those who were involved in the constitutional discussion, either pro or anti-ratification, were concerned that after a certain amount of time went by, people would forget. And Richmond says sometimes it's not even skullduggery. It's just that maybe the definitions of words change, or people don't understand what's going on. I mean, it could be, some of it could be innocent, some of it is not, because of people who drive it. So I think that's something that people got to think about. Is as Dave said, the whole idea about the covenant community on a smaller scale, doing that sort of thing, and then having relationships between them. Maybe we could be a little bit like, I guess what Murray Rothbard said Ireland was like, right, Dave? Where he said they had anarchy, but it wasn't like chaos.
Right.
But you had these tribes or clans or whatever, and they worked together, and you could leave one and go to the other one, that sort of thing. And they had laws, but it was more like private law that had grown organically, and it was not through the political system and through governmental legislation and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Dave, you want to respond? I was going to just add what Dennis was saying, that the idea of the sheriff, to me, is the personification of that. When you had the concept put into the Constitution of, especially their state constitutions, of these local sheriffs being the only duly elected by the people enforcer of whatever statutes the people supposedly agreed upon, right? We're putting that under umbrella and letting all things being equal. But the sheriff being that, you go back to what you just said about the Irish, and you could have a small community and you appoint one guy or a couple guys that are deputized, and there you everybody chips in, and we pay them enough of a salary to where they're the protectors. But then they also call upon, this was the system that I see from our founding fathers, that they were able to do that and say, okay, we're going to have this, but we're also going to have a well-regulated militia. And it's everybody once again has their own vested interest in this. And there is no necessity for these large centralized governments in that dynamic, in that structure, because it's localized. It's as you said earlier, Dave, talking about contract law. People have lost that. It's become the what would you say, the speech of lawyers, and it's polluted, and it's lost in translation, these contracts, and they wiggle out of them, and you got to do this, and you got to, I didn't read the contract, and we sign a freaking contract for the update. They just had an update on the TV before we started the show, and they wanted me to agree to all their new terms of this thing. Well, that's a contract. There's when you sign up for Disney Plus, you sign the agreement there. Well, on page 294, it says that if you get hurt or injured or killed at a Disney resort, you or your family can't sue Disney resorts. I didn't sign up anything about Disney resorts. Well, it's all tied together. It's in the contract. And so these contracts have become, and we live under an incorporated government, and it's become so convoluted. We've got to get back to having tangibility with our neighbors and forming our own contracts one-on-one and coalition, almost biblically, with we're gonna cut a covenant, and I'm gonna cut my hand, you're gonna cut your hand, we're gonna commingle our blood, or I'm gonna give you we're gonna exchange sandals, whatever the custom is, but we're making a covenant agreement. And that's what our founding fathers, I believe, did with the founding documents, and we've mentioned a number of them. Is these were, because it was tangible to the people, because they had ownership, they were covenant documents. And they also understood the covenant with Christ. They understood the new covenant. They understood these ideas, and it's been washed, and the people have been brainwashed, and it's been so diluted that we've lost even what a contract or an agreement with, used to be. You shake somebody's hand and that was it. Now you have to have, 15 pages protecting your ass on this and this and this and this. And if you don't do this and do that, and we've lost those things. And with that, the country has eroded away. Dave, you want to respond to any of that, what Dennis said or what I just said?
I guess, again, I don't have that much to add, though, that you're right. I mean, the whole central government is based on, control by the national lobbies in Washington, D.C., where the biggest pieces of legislation are thousands of pages long, with pork spending and special allocations from the federal treasury far beyond what Article 1, Section 8 allows the feds to do. But it's never brought up. It's almost never rejected by the parties, stewards within Congress, let's call them, that are part of a coalition that's built to support the president, not built to support their constituents, built to support the party leadership, the president, and the national lobbies over us. So yeah, I'm about political decentralization in its limit, whether that manifests in nullification, maybe expat causes, secession, peaceful secession is what I would advocate for, and fragmentation. I think really those causes are worth defending, no matter how radical they seem or unpopular they are with some circles. Because what I can tell you is that whenever they're unpopular with some circles, once those people have their guy get out of the Oval Office, they suddenly become more popular. So hopefully, persuading people of these things, some of the messaging and ideas hold beyond the tribal attachments, but oftentimes they don't, unfortunately. I don't have a great silver bullet for solving that one.
Well, and I like what you said, that the difference between the word I used was balkanization and that idea, and you said faction.
Fragmentation, yeah.
That's what you said. I was drawing a blank on it for a second. Fragmentation, and we've seen it. We had it here in Michigan with Goshen, where they didn't want the battery. The people didn't want the battery factory, and they came in there and they overturned the entire board. And there's been a number of instances in California. There was a turnover of a whole city council. In Texas, there's been a number of them where the people just went in and said, "No, we've had enough." School boards have been complete school boards without elections, without anything. The school board walked out without adjourning. Well, it's a violation of Robert's Rules of Order, and the people can immediately go up there and elect new people to take over the board at that moment because it's Robert's Rules and all. So I love that concept on the local levels. But you're right. Does it have legs? Does it have any type of movement past that moment to where it just has longevity? It has legs in there. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I handed my pocket constitution over to Dennis, and I want to kind of finish up our discussion tonight, going over a little bit of the 9th and 10th Amendments and what we can do application wise, what we can do pushing back in different areas, how we can apply those, and really diving into some of the language if we can do that, because they're both pretty simple and concise. Maybe Dennis, you want to read both of them.
Sure.
And then Dave, let's have a discussion about that aspect. If there is anything you wanted to respond to what I just said about the turning over school boards and stuff like that.
No, we can go through the amendments.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay. So here's the 9th Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
So where would we start on that? Where would we start, guys?
Well, let's start with the 9th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment, or the 9th Amendment, is often called a rule of construction. It doesn't really give any powers or define something that the federal government can't intrude upon, but it's called a rule of construction because one of the prevailing oppositional talking points against the Constitution by anti-federalists was to say that, hey, we do want a Bill of Rights, but if you have a Bill of Rights, there has to be something that says, well, we don't have enough ink to articulate the amount of traditional British liberties that there are, traditional English liberties, now American liberties, such that, someone could imply that this was the only rights that people within the United States possess. So they passed this rule of construction to say that, this list should not be construed to mean a totality of rights. People have traditional rights beyond these, and that's what the Ninth Amendment did. And I'll pause there until you want to move on to the 10th Amendment.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Yep.
Dave nailed it again.
Yeah, exactly. So let's move on to the 10th, Dave. Let's go ahead and touch on that one, and then we'll pick apart a few pieces in there and see where our discussion takes us.
Okay, so the 10th Amendment is, in my estimation, the most important aspect of the federal Constitution. And Jefferson agreed. In fact, in a 1790 document, I actually referred to this earlier in our conversation, refuting the allegations of Alexander Hamilton that the feds had the right to enact a central bank. Jefferson refuted that, and at the very beginning of his refutation, he said, "I consider this the foundation of our federal Constitution." And then he went on to quote the 10th Amendment, which at that time was not yet ratified, but it looked like it was going to be ratified. What this says explicitly is that the federal government is confined to the enumerated powers. And this enumerated powers doctrine was different from the way other governments operated. It was anti-arbitrary, meaning that the federal government was supposed to be nailed down to legislate only on these specific matters. And if it went beyond that, it was null or void law. And, it's so important to nail this down because when the Constitution was being ratified, this was a huge conflict. This was a bitter fight between rival factions in most of the U.S. states, especially places like New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Those were the fiercest wars when it came to the ratification battle. And over and over and over, you had these anti-federalist people that didn't want to ratify the Constitution coming forward and saying that this government is going to run roughshod over the states. It's going to pervert the powers that we want the states to possess. And it was made implicit in ratifying the Constitution by the Federalists that, hey, the general government only has the powers explicitly delegated to it. People like Fisher Ames made that argument in Massachusetts. George Nicholas and Edmund Randolph and James Madison made that argument in Virginia. James Iredell made that argument in North Carolina. Charles Pinckney made that argument in South Carolina in various different words. But the anti-federalists didn't want to take that for granted. And to be frank, most of the Federalists never wanted a Bill of Rights. People like Hamilton argued against it in later Federalist essays, saying that, well, if it is true that the federal government only has these explicit powers, so why would we enumerate exceptions to the powers that aren't granted to the general government in the first place? And the anti-federalists said, well, we don't really want to take your word for that one, Alexander Hamilton. And good that they didn't, because the Bill of Rights still serves as something that the citizenry can look back on and say, well, no, this was very definitive in what it said the government can't do. Now, you will have people that say, well, the Bill of Rights still proves to be a bad thing because the general government regulates those amendments all the time. They pretend that they don't exist in special cases. Somehow the Second Amendment, even according to people like Scalia, doesn't give you the right to possess what politicians use the propaganda term for assault rifle. But at the same time, that is kind of a primer of liberty that the anti-federalists wanted to preserve for people to look back on, to hold governments accountable when they did pervert our rights. So that's where I'll stop. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that was great.
Yeah.
Very succinct.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. And that was important. So again, the 10th Amendment and working with organizations like the 10th Amendment Center, we can look at model legislation and things of that nature that we could utilize in each of the 50 states to erect barriers to federal usurpation of power.
Yeah, I agree. I really endorse the 10th Amendment Center, everything they've done. I'm not unbiased in this. I did write and contribute to the 10th Amendment Center for almost a decade, but Michael Bolden, Mike Meharry, the work they do is great. And part of that work is that model legislation, which you can pick up, adjust according to your state's purposes, and introduced in the legislature. And some of their legislation has gotten through the states, like in Idaho, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, which nullified all future gun control, got signed into law in, I think, 2014 by Governor Butch Otter. They've had some legislation that's gotten through to preserve right to try so that people with terminal illnesses can take drugs that the FDA doesn't want them to take, no matter how deadly their illness is, and things like that. But like I said, you should be able to take these tools and apply them to many issues, and the 10th Amendment Center has built model legislation to do just that.
Right. In fact, here in Michigan, we had what they thought was the best, a Fourth Amendment Protection Act.
Yeah.
Our friend Martin Hawrelak, who was a state representative, actually got that through, and I know they were thought that was really good. Of course, on the next thing is, right, Dave, we have to make sure that when the states pass this legislation, they're living up to it or doing what they are instructed to do with that legislation to fight for our freedom against the feds.
That's right, because law and constitutions are only as good as they're enforced. There's selective enforcement of laws not only at the state and local level, and you have, people in power that can run roughshod over the defined law that the citizenry wants that state to have, and it's incumbent on the people that live within that state or locality to push back against the government on that. And it's not an easy thing. Sometimes a lot of these things get lost in the shuffle, and the partisan attachments rip these things apart on the local level. I've seen it be as corrupt as possible on the local level too, but it is incumbent on us to keep pushing. As Jefferson once wrote, the ground of liberty is gained by inches. And that's something that Bolden always talks about too. And I think it's so important.
Dave, when we're talking about the 9th and 10th and that, I was thinking of this, the idea of things that are unconstitutional, that automatically null and void. Have you, in all of your studies, and even Dennis as well, I think the two experts here on this, have you guys seen, or could you cite any actual cases where something was brought forth that was automatically in violation of the Constitution and was immediately struck down before it even had a chance? Or has that statute ever really had any tangible application? We read that hey, anything that's unconstitutional is automatically null and void. Well, okay, then how many cases have you guys ever seen that just went out and said, no, this is not constitutional, here's why, boom, done, out of here? Because we've got, as we said, bills that are thousands of pages long. We've got hundreds of thousands of lines in our code, our USC code. Am I saying that right? The US, yeah, USC code. And it's like, they just keep writing new laws, more and more and more and more. It's like, have there ever been any challenges to these things on the basis that they're just straight up unconstitutional from day one?
Almost always on state laws only are struck down by the general courts, the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court in many cases. Almost never when it comes to laws passed by Congress are going to be struck down by a different branch of the federal government that's also a part of the government. It rarely happens. It's happened so few times you can count it on two hands for the most part when it comes to federal laws. Now, when it comes to state laws, they do this all the time, and that's why it's a total perversion of federalism by adjudicating disputes that were not theirs to adjudicate in the first place. And a lot of this goes back to, the perversions of the 14th Amendment and what's called the incorporation doctrine. I won't go down a rabbit hole on that, but I'm sorry to say that this is largely the product of a bygone era. It's very rare that the feds do anything that is struck down by a different branch of the feds. That did happen, sometimes in the 19th century, and sometimes you did have a quick movement on the part of Congress to fix some things, like you had situations like the 11th Amendment was passed after this ability to coerce Georgia into a lawsuit called Chisholm versus Georgia, where Georgia did not want that lawsuit to be held, but within the government, within the federal Supreme Court. So it just didn't show up. And then the Supreme Court made a judgment against Georgia for the damages that was owed supposedly to a British national whose property was taken from him. But the Congress said, well, Georgia didn't consent to this, so we're going to ratify the 11th Amendment, rein that in right away. I think 2 years later, in the form of the 11th Amendment. The Chisholm versus Georgia, I think, was in 1793 or 1794 or something like that. And there was a quick remedy to that. We just don't have that kind of politician anymore. There's too much national lobby influence, and I don't see the way to fix it unless this government is curtailed, that it's less big, it's less encumbering. We don't have an empire. We don't have a welfare state doling out $7 trillion a year. I just don't see how it's possible to fix that the more and more government grows and the more influence that national lobbies have.
Yeah.
Right. And I was going to say, a few years ago, And of course, Dave's commentary was outstanding as always. A few years ago, Tom Woods talked about this situation, and he said that the number of times that the Supreme Court would find something unconstitutional, I think they found one over, I don't know, a stretch of several decades. He goes, really? That's all they could find?
Yeah.
I think they've had maybe 2 or 3 or 4 since then. But again, it's a very, very small number. But then the other part is, as again, Michael Bolden and the 10th Amendment Center say, when it comes to the Supreme Court, they issue opinions. Treat them that way. And so the Supreme Court or other federal courts maybe aren't, not maybe, they aren't doing their job for constitutional enforcement. So that it's up to us, which really was what was intended in the first place.
Yep.
It's just that it seems like it is a very unequal fight right now. But so you say, well, is it ever decided that something's unconstitutional? Sure, all the time by people that follow it, right?
Right.
Then the question is, what to do next, and how do we prevent this unconstitutional attack on our liberty, or this immoral or unreasonable thing, even if somebody thinks maybe it does fit in within the Constitution, from abusing everybody. And that's where we have these different nullification fights, like on things like the NDAA indefinite detention provisions that was up around 2012 or so, right? That was a big deal, and things of that nature. And sometimes it's people just, again, not cooperating or finding a different thing to do, a way around it to just have the non-cooperation be so great that if we don't cooperate, the team of federal agents to enforce tyranny, it usually isn't large enough to do it if people will say no.
Right.
And so that seems to be at times an effective matter, but you also need to have I think a critical mass of people that are willing to do that. So one person can't be made an example of. And if you had when states are standing up, it's always much better if you have several at the same time.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in a number of areas, so that there's been some pushback, some reduction in the amount of government, and a reduction in the amount of tyranny, at least for a time, through these local and state nullification efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it especially with like drug prohibition, with marijuana prohibition, where it's like whatever you think about marijuana, it's like that tool, it's almost impossible to argue that hasn't been effective, because again, it's on the books in Congress that this is prohibited. The states cannot allow people to ingest marijuana. And yet something like, 2/3 to 3/4 of the states, depending on how you break this down when it comes to medicinal versus recreational marijuana, I think 2/3 of the states have some form of that, while the feds maintain this is illegal. And we've always been told, well, if you defy the feds, they'll just roll in the tanks, they'll just enforce the law and put you behind bars, but they just don't have the political capital to enforce that subject that way. And I want to make all subjects that way. I want sanctuary cities for guns that way, such that people don't accept this. They don't accept the NFA. They don't accept federal stooges and the ATF and the FBI, terrorist organizations, if there ever were, to enforce this lunacy. And that's where I want to see America go.
Another great point, I was thinking about this earlier today. Right now, the controversy about flock and axon cameras and the license plate readers. And I recall reading in the 10th Amendment Center stuff, Dave, maybe you wrote this. I don't remember who wrote this stuff up, but the entire license plate reading program was a surreptitious thing that came from the DEA working with state and local police departments. The DEA is not constitutionally authorized. The war on drugs is not constitutionally authorized. And then they had this secret license plate reading program, which it turned out, as a number of people on all sorts of political spectrums have said, is really dangerous. And it's collecting information about people that can be used as part of this panopticon, this overarching surveillance state employed by Leviathan. Somebody following Lenin's words could say, "You show me the man, and I'll show you the crime."
Right.
And this is clearly invasive and anti-liberty, and shouldn't be around in any case. But it's also not constitutional, and also in the case of the license plate readers, was never even voted on by anybody. Right. They just started doing it.
Right.
I mean, that's the craziest thing, right? And you see this effort right now, this psychological operation to say, well, these flock cameras, these axon cameras, they're no different than a cell phone. And that's just so absurd, because you chose the cell phone. You bought the cell phone. You can turn the cell phone off. You know the location of the cell phone. You know what it's capable of. And when it comes to flock cameras, people just do not know this. This is a total perversion of our privacy rights. And there's no real free market interest in this. There's no free market interest in a surveillance state, not only on the federal level, but down into the community level. The people that these groups market to are police forces and law enforcement. They're not people that are just yearning and aching for this technology. Now, I don't discount individuals that might want security equipment on their own property. I think that there's a lot of use for that. And that's why ultimately, prosperous societies break down on property rights, because I think if you own the property, you should have that. But when it comes to a government monopoly on a surveillance state at the community level, it really is horrifying. And I'm really glad how much interest there is on this issue, especially with young people, because I never thought that this would be one of the biggest issues right now. And it has come to be that.
Yeah, no question about it. But as you say, it's galvanizing people. So this could be the sort of thing that could light the brush fires of liberty or something like that. We even saw it in our county, in Oakland County, that there was huge upset about this.
Sure.
But
it's gonna take one of these catalyzing events. I mean, we saw a lot with COVID. We're seeing it with the flock cameras. We're seeing it with just the debt, not in mass things, but we're seeing it. I've been involved in a couple now with the protests against the Muslims. So you're seeing the Muslim takeovers. You're seeing it with flock cameras. You're seeing it with when it was COVID and people pushed back and I'm not going to comply to this garbage. You're seeing these pockets, but what is going to, I'm waiting for one big, and maybe it doesn't have to be one big, but as our founding documents or our severing documents say, that we have after a long train of usurpations. Well, we're seeing this long train of usurpations once again, and we need to have a new birth of liberty, true birth of liberty, not as Lincoln destroying the state sovereignty, but as true birth of liberty back on these sovereign souls. I want. Is there any more that we want to discuss on the 9th and 10th before I do final thoughts on? And I just want to ask about terms here. But is there any other things that you were thinking about with the 9th and 10th, and just this idea that it'll tie into the terms too? You ready for that, Dave? Yeah. So I was just thinking about this. It's bothered me for years, and there's a number of ones that bother me. Like I usually say the preamble of our show is on the show we cuss, we don't curse or swear, right? Because cursing is the opposite of blessing, and swearing is pledging an allegiance to or a fealty to something. Whereas cussing is straight up just using cuss words, and you can put a number of them in your category. It's cussing. So when people go, I didn't want to use a curse word, or I didn't want to use a swear word, I'm like, go look up the definitions. I got an 1828 Webster's dictionary over here. Go look it up. Cussing is using a whatever, dropping an F-bomb, whatever these terms we put in that category. Right. Anyways, another one that really bothers me is right in the Declaration, right in the preamble, it says these true self-evident, that among them are certain. Most people say inalienable, and I have for 25 years or more, I say unalienable. Breaking it down, 1828. What do you say? The dashes for the phonic pronunciation. Unalienable, because these were rights that you couldn't put a lien on them. You couldn't encumber them with a debt or a restriction. And when you read it that way, because most people go, oh, it's inalienable, and they don't even have a concept of what an alien is, and it's goofy.
Right. Yeah.
But when you say it's unalienable, you can't put a lien on it. And as I've been a builder for years, and I know about liens on that you can put on a property on a construction site, and that's the only way I could potentially get my money out of something if the person I contract with decides to go sideways. And so I think about just that term, and then these two terms, Dave. I want you to address these. The common welfare, and you brought it up a couple different times. What's $7 trillion in welfare, and both of these terms, to me, the first one lesser to a lot of people, but welfare has been so twisted and bastardized to then allow the federal government to have such an overreach of tyranny into the lives of people One, by getting people on welfare. I was hanging out with a bunch of people at a beautiful black church today, and these people are awakened at that church, and they know. They're like, yeah, they got them on welfare and got the dads out of the home, and it's the welfare, which was not the intent of the founding fathers. And Dennis brought this up earlier, talking about terms that get twisted and we lose the meanings. And 250 years later, nobody knows what it actually truly meant at that time about that. I want you to, as a historian and diving into some of those, Dave, kind of address a little bit of that concept of terms being twisted and lost in
Yeah, I mean, that's probably among the most twisted, right? The general welfare clause is often cited to allow Washington to do anything or everything. You might as well call it the anything and everything clause. That's how it's portrayed anyways. But really, this was basically what this came from was the Articles of Confederation that actually had a general welfare clause. And one of the chief things that people say about the Articles of Confederation today is that it didn't allow for much of a central government at all. It did allow the states to pass resolutions and under the Congress to pass resolutions, but ultimately those resolutions under the Confederation government, under the Articles of Confederation, had to enforce those universally. But no one would say, well, this allowed the Articles of Confederation to do anything or everything, to legislate on any topic. And don't take my word for it. Take a look at the document. There is that term that the resolutions would be passed to the general welfare of the state. So what it was talking about, and what it was talking about in the federal Constitution, our second Constitution, the one in force right now, is it enforced? I mean, it really isn't enforced in some ways, but this was made to make it clear that the powers that the general government had were conducive to the general benefit of the states. It's not to create any new specific powers. It was to define the reason for which those powers existed. And then you can go back to the ratification text. I point this out, some people saying at the time, including Madison, that, this can't be twisted to support things such as a 1792 Fisheries Act that was going to give subsidies to fisheries off the coast of New England. You couldn't justify it on the basis of the general welfare clause, because if you could justify that on that basis, you can justify it to provide things like schools and other things that the feds just take for granted now as part and parcel of the Constitution. It didn't create any new powers. It simply defined the powers that were enumerated. So that's what I'll say about general welfare. And, it's just so absurd, because this clause has been twisted to do stuff like I think it was a 1937 case of Wickard versus Filburn, one of the worst violations of individual liberty in the world, because what you had is these Great Depression programs that were seeking to constrain and set price controls on grain. Well, there's this family in Ohio that grew a surplus of the grain, didn't transport it outside the state, didn't ship it to anyone else, actually consumed that in their own homestead. And this was determined to be a violation of the general welfare clause. Just so absurd. But, it's only gotten more haywire since then when it comes to applying this and, adjudicating it by the federal courts.
Dennis?
Oh, yes. Well, I think Kevin Gutzman calls it the good and plenty clause. Right. The general welfare clause.
Yeah.
But again, people, yes. So there's an ignorance of all these things. It just isn't taught anymore. And I know that Dave does a lot of great work on constitutional education. We talk about Michael Bolden, Mike Meharry, Chris Ann Hall is somebody else that does a lot of work on this. And Josie, the red-headed libertarian on Twitter X, has a lot of interesting things.
Is that her official name, Dennis? The redheaded.
That's her name on Twitter X.
The redheaded. Okay, I don't want.
Her first name is it Josie Wabach?
Josie, yeah, I know her. I met her a few times.
Okay, because we want to be very politically correct in this show. That, only a ginger can call it another ginger. So.
No, we're politically incorrect.
But, that's right. My bad.
But historically accurate. Okay.
Yes.
and morally proper, or something like that. So okay. So anyway, so there's all those things. I'm trying to think of what else we could cover. Well, I guess one other area where we are seeing these days a lot of nullification on the personal level as well as at the state level. We mentioned the Sound Money Defense League, but we also see individuals utilizing sound money, gold and silver, and then others using cryptocurrency, and people can argue back and forth. about whether that is or not. But the monopoly on having to use what the feds have done to the monetary system is clearly unconstitutional, along with a lot of other bad things, and so that's being nullified at various levels, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah, certainly so. And that's another perversion of our constitutional system, because there were people that were fierce advocates of a central bank that went to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, tried to put that on the table for consideration. And not only was it struck down, and this is explicitly spelled out in the notes of Madison, who took notes during the Philadelphia Convention, but despite that, you had in the first Congress a drive to institute a national bank. Now, the national bank that first took root, mostly at the behest of people like Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris, that bank did not even have close to the amount of powers that the central bank does today. But back then, it was explicitly put in the Constitution that the states and the feds can't coin anything but gold and silver and make them legal currency tender. And what legal tender currency is basically every establishment within a locale has to accept that as, a base medium of exchange. But the only thing that you were allowed to do that with was gold and silver. Well, we have central banks that took the United States off the gold standard permanently, although it was pitched by Nixon as a temporary measure in 1971, ending the Bretton Woods system. And then you have the debasement of the currency going into overdrive, especially since 1971. But even before that, to the point that now the dollar is worth something like 3% of what it was in 1913. So, yeah, I mean, sound money is a really good hedge against inflation, because the legal tender currency is being debased more. It's more than 3% that they tell you, because the CPI is not exactly the most accurate kind of barometer of such things. And, I support state level efforts to make depositories and such, like I think Texas has and a few other states have.
And as Rick Rule calls it, the CPI is the CP lie.
Right. That's right.
But that's not really inflation. The inflation is the growth in the supply of money and credit.
Yes.
And that results in currency depreciation, and that's what we're dealing with. It is interesting if you think about it, with all the debt, and nothing we're discussing here, in case anybody's wondering, nothing we're discussing here is investment advice. None of us are. I think I'm right in saying this. None of us are registered investment professionals at this point.
What?
And so, as John Polomny says, do your own due diligence. It's your money. It's your responsibility. But we're talking about these things from a governmental and constitutional standpoint. But also, it's interesting. Bob Prechter used to point out, and I think maybe you see the size of the debt that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's huge. And I think you could call it the mother of all short position. So then you scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute. Could there be a shortage of dollars at some point? And I think at times maybe we start going in that direction a little bit, but as soon as that appears maybe to be happening, we know that they will push some buttons and all of a sudden there'll be a lot more, right? And so I guess the answer is again, as John Polomny and Rick Rule and others say, is these politicians, what they're going to do is they're going to say, nobody wants to be the one that institutes actual spending discipline. Nobody wants to be the one that says, that benefit that you thought you were going to get, you're not going to get that. So here's your check, and here's the amount of the number of dollars you're getting is going to be what you had anticipated.
Right.
But what those dollars get is going to be worse, and that's been the story of our lifetimes, with a few brief
respites,
intervals, or maybe it goes in the other direction.
Yeah.
But more and more, we're probably, they say we're past the point of no return on this now.
Mm-hmm. Well, very few people know that the dollars that are in their wallet right now they're not worth what they think they are.
Right.
And that's pretty scary. And a lot of people still to this day don't really understand the whole concept of, let's say, cryptocurrency or what have you. But really, it's very closely aligned with what we have in terms of a money system right now. I mean, do we really, if I pull out $1, is that really $1? It's not.
No, and the exchange is only
2 years ago, That's the comparison point. And what bugs me so much is several generations of Americans have been propagandized to believe that this gradual debasement of the currency is just like some law of nature. That's the way things always they're meant to be, and they will always be. And there's very little education on the other side of that. People like on this show that know better than that, and that is horrifying to me. That's almost just totally accepted. And the propagandists will tell you that happens for every other reason than why it actually does. It's the federal banks printing the currency. It's not corporate greed. It's not a law of nature. It's not the way things have always been. In fact, most of human history has gone on without central banks that debase the currency in such a way. And that propensity only started in England in the early 18th century and, in the United States around the same time.
Well, and I think about it from this perspective. The coining of money does allow for, I don't want to say inflation, but it is, if I go out and I mine gold or silver, and then I bring that into the federal government and they take their percentage of coining it and give me back coins, okay, then I am inflating the overall supply of coins available, but I'm not debasing the value of those coins. I'm just increasing the supply that has been, because now I'm going to take those coins back and maybe I buy another machine or I pay another employee or I do another thing. So I'm increase, the wealth is increasing versus being debauched and decreasing through the inflationary systems that we have. And they knew this concept because they had it in ancient times where they had their coins, but they didn't have should have constitutional restraints now. We're supposed to have, but they would take and they would cut the little pieces off them, and now that coin is still supposed to be valued at what it was before, but you cut a bunch of chunks off of it, and they would debase the coins like that. And they did have levels where our coins are today, where it's lead with a copper covering or a silver covering on it. They had that in ancient times too. So they did manipulate their money supply, even when it was supposed to be a hard type tangible currency versus the piece of paper you were talking about, right, Glenn, that we all carry around. But those concepts, I think that's what, there was so much wisdom in our founding fathers, and that was one of the things, is the money. They're like, look, we don't want to have a central bank, but we do need to have a central currency that can be agreed upon, the intrinsic value of it that can be used for barter or exchange amongst we the people. Dave, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, more or less, I think that's true. I come from the Austrian school of economics that doesn't believe in intrinsic value, though I believe that, as Karl Menger wrote, all value is subjective, and
what we believe it is
not really intrinsically in a substance. It's what people think is the value of that thing, and it's in your mind more than it is in the substance, because you apply that to say like something like Bitcoin. Well, one Bitcoin, the value today is something like, what is it right now? It's like $80,000, maybe $78,000. I'm something of a Bitcoin enthusiast, but there's nothing intrinsic in Bitcoin. But it's not people that think it has that value, that it is ultimately tradable at that rate. And, the labor theory of value, falls short on some of the same premises as well.
Okay.
You mean Marx was wrong?
Marx and Adam Smith were wrong, as it turns out, on that one.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, and the other point too, many people, the great Dr. Ron Paul has pointed this out with gold. I mean, there's a scarcity value to it, and yes, there's subjective value, and people subjectively trust having gold, and it not being a counterparty or having any counterparty risk or being a liability. It's just solid.
Yeah.
And so that's why that's
and that's really what I was pointing out, was not necessarily that it's. What I was really going for was the tangibility of it, and the idea that, and I've had Bitcoin on here, our friend Shane and a number of his friends on here talking about Bitcoin and its advantages and what we can do with it. But what I was pointing out, I used the word intrinsic value. What I really mean was the tangible, that dollar, you can light it on fire, it's done. Right. If I take a piece of gold in here, even if I melt it down, it's still that gold. It's still that 1 ounce of gold or that 1 ounce of silver, and so that's all I was saying about that is it has a tangibility. Now, if I'm hungry and somebody doesn't want to take that gold in exchange for food, it means nothing, because we're agreeing it has no agreeable value to that person. They don't want to agree with me on that. But I was saying that at least gold in the past and silver have been something that is, you can't debase that gold into, you can't set it on fire and turn it into, garbage. Whereas a dollar, you can set it on fire and now it's burned up. That was kind of my point, but I agree with you 100%. And Dennis and I have had these discussions about intrinsic values and everything. It really comes down
subjective value.
Subjective value is what you and I agree the value is. That really comes back to barter, and barter is more of a foundation of exchange and monetary, because what you and I can agree on the value is, then we exchange it.
Yeah.
If I say, hey, I need you to do 4 hours of work for me. Well, I'll take that, I'll take 2 bushels of your corn. Okay. Well, there's no money exchange. That's just straight up. We're trading value for value.
But then that's where the idea of gold or any other form of money comes in, when they say, rather than having to cart around bushels of corn or whatever.
Yeah.
Here
then
you
I
go.
can say, okay, these 2 bushels of
it
corn are
represents
worth this coin.
Here's my labor. Here you go.
Exactly.
We'll trade.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I just say real quickly, there's at least one example that comes to mind where, Dave, wasn't it Spain, where they went to the New World, discovered a lot of gold and took it back to Spain, and then prices started rising because they had more gold that came in that they had taken from.
That's why I got to pick your guys' brains.
I thought I remember.
Dave, do you have a comment on that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Spanish coins became like the most circulating currencies in like the time of the founders too, because there was a shortage of British currency. And I think that's right. I mean, technically, bullion is inflationary, not in the sense we think about when it comes to like fiat currency, but if, new deposits of gold are found in mine, technically that's more inflationary than something with absolute finite supply. Now, there is an ultimate limit of the amount of bullion that exists in any type of metal particularly, but we might not find that limit in our entire lifetime. So this gets into more like technical theories, but yeah, I think I understand.
I don't know if I want to give Dave, if I want to go with you first. I think I'm going to start with Glenn, and then Dennis, and then Dave. I'm going to go to you, and then I'll just wrap up the show. But Glenn, give me your final thoughts, just on tonight's discussion. Anything that stood out to you? I know you took some notes there.
Yeah.
Just your final thoughts, and then of course we do the ritual of signing my paper.
Sure.
But give me your final thoughts, my friend.
At the risk of sounding alarmist, though, it just is frustrating in terms of how little people are aware of all of these issues and all these topics that we brought up tonight, and trying to start where, how do we get back to this, or how do we do that? I'm not even sure we have enough people to even do something about what we're losing in terms of liberty, what we're doing about our money,
that can hold an intelligent conversation on this stuff.
It's most people, I don't know if they can count to 1,000, and let alone, take a look at some of these issues. And it's very disturbing. And I think because we all have a little bit of a responsibility to help educate people, we have to do that. We have to make them aware. We have to point to sources of information.
Yeah.
We have to point to where can we get, like books that Dave's written and things like that, and really force the issue and challenge people a little bit. So, we can hope for the best, but I'm not feeling very optimistic right now. So.
Right. Dennis, you're up next. Your final thoughts on tonight's discussion. I think it was
it's been an outstanding discussion. It was a real pleasure to meet Glenn tonight, and
yes,
and
absolutely
share fellowship with him and thoughts, and of course Dave Benner is a number one, so it's always great to have interaction with Dave, and he has so much knowledge here. Yes, his books are great. We heard him give that speech at the Grand New Party dinner a couple of years ago.
Yep.
And Dave is somebody that you can always trust to give you the right information. We a lot of historical things and various folks there, so that's really important. And I'm glad that he's a friend and does all these things. And I will say again that we have our liberty as a gift from God, and therefore it's our responsibility. Chris Ann Hall talks about this. We have a property in our liberty. Was it Adams that said that, Dave? One of the
not sure about that one.
Well, one of them said that, but like as Chris Ann says, so since we have a property, and it's our duty to protect liberty and to pass it on to the next generations, because how else would they know unless they heard from us and saw us fight for it? And
Right.
as one, either Snowden or Assange, one of them said, there's going to be, talk about expectation of privacy and expectation of being left alone. There's not going to be any of that left. Think of how this has changed since we were children.
Yeah.
It's been dramatic. It seems a little bit at a time,
Right.
maybe not so much, but it has been dramatic. It has been destructive, and it's our duty. It's our duty as human beings. It's our duty as creations of the Almighty. It's our duty as fathers to protect liberty, to do that for our families, to do that for future generations, and to show that we are worthy of it. And so I thank God for what He has done in this regard, and I thank you, gentlemen, and particularly Dave, but all of you in helping to move this forward. This idea.
Amen. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave, to give your final thoughts. And Dennis, I want you, while we're doing that, if there's anything from Gypsy Magic or anybody else in the chat that you want to highlight before we close out after Dave gets done with his final thought. But Dave, go ahead with your final thought, and then we'll touch chat real quick, and then I'll close it out for the night.
Sure. I just want to say, hey, thanks for having me. I do have a lot of proposals for how I think society can be better run, but I don't even claim to have the silver bullet. But what I will say is, like Glenn said, and what Dennis said, both of you said it in your own way, is that we do need to educate the populace, no matter what comes after that, no matter what strategy is utilized against tyrannical government. It does start with information. And right now we're on the cusp of a new information age that really the US hasn't seen. I mean, there's a new independent media where there's more voices and choices than ever. Independent media is kind of breaking the wall that was once built by these corporate giants that filtered all opinions through something like 3 or 4 cable news networks and 3 or 4 printed newspapers. And now is the opportunity to get people engaged, tell them the truth, and hope that the rest will follow. And it's not just hope. I think that Andrew Breitbart was right when he said politics is downstream from culture. So if you can move the culture on certain issues, hopefully through education, through truth telling, when it matters most, as people like Assange, as people like Snowden and John Kiriakou and others did, when it was most controversial and perilous to their own livelihoods, that is what we need to do now more than ever. So that's where I'll end.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'll just.
Oh, is there a couple from Gypsy? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say just real quickly, the outstanding, of course, by Dave. He nailed it as he always does. And yes, we should give credit to the great Gypsy Magic, the champion of chat rooms.
Yeah.
Because if you talk about lighting the brush fires of liberty, the tireless irate minority.
Yeah.
Gypsy Magic is one of those people.
Yep.
And so he's been with us for this whole thing. He's clearly dedicated. He's a man of principle, a man of action, and a man of perseverance and great wit and humor. And so we thank Gypsy Magic for his contributions as well. And he said, defend the guard, all 50 states.
Yep.
And I know that's a cause that's important to all of us here. And so if anybody's watching this, one of the things you should definitely do is look at the Defend the Guard legislation, Bring Our Troops Home.us, led by the great Sergeant Dan McKnight and the work he does. Yep. And I've noticed recently, Dan's really been on fire. And he is a man of great principle as well, and a man of action. And you're blessed if you get to hear him speak, and he can talk about his experiences in the military and what he's done in his political advocacy. And he is clearly one who does not let political party loyalties or political party games overwhelm the important issues and the important philosophy of defending liberty. And I tell you what, that's somebody else. And I know we had him on here. We talked to him one time.
Yeah, we need to get him back on again.
Yeah, so yeah. He is a great man. He and a partner in this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gypsy's final thought on there: allowing the Fed to continue. This is Gypsy's final thought in the chat. Allowing the Fed to continue to guard the American economy is like allowing Satan to guard the very throne of God. You can't compromise with what you can't trust. It must be cast out forever. Yeah, I agree with that, Gypsy.
Amen.
I appreciate that, guys. We pinned it in there. Nico, can you hit the pin again, buddy? Scroll up in the chat and hit the pin. There you go. You're trying to find it. I put it up there for Dave's books. He has you've got your Thomas Paine book, and then you have one on the 14th Amendment, and you have your other one on the Compact of the Republic. the 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine. Actually, I'm going to see if my tower's, nope, that's not working. I was going to click to that page, but Thomas Paine, a lifetime of radicalism. I'm just trying to read the scroll on the book. I had it written down. Oh, I've got it written down in the notes. A lifetime of radicalism. So those are those the only three, Dave, that you have right now?
Yeah, it is. And if you want personalized copies, you can get them at davidbenner.square.site. But either way you order them, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. And don't feel obligated. But if you're interested in the topics we discussed, you'll find a lot more to like in those books.
Yeah. Say that again for us one more time.
Yeah, davidbenner.square.site. That is how you can get personalized.
Guys, go over there and support what Dave's doing. He's a patriot and a historian and somebody who's trying to educate, as we are on the show tonight. And that's what we all need to be out there doing, is enlightening people once again, because it's an enlightened populace that can truly embrace the freedom. There we go. I think that's, or did you do that, Nico? You're the man. Nico threw it in the chat. You know what, Nico? Go down and throw it right here in the comments over on that side. You see the, oh, you can't do it. I'll do it. I got it. Dave, thanks once again for joining us tonight. Appreciate everybody. Like, share, and subscribe. Do all that stuff. Dave, you do your own podcast?
Yeah, I do. Check out Liberty Vault on YouTube. I'm also on Spotify and anywhere you can find podcasts. I do a lot of political commentary, especially on U.S. foreign policy and deep state skullduggery, I'll just say. And I appreciate anyone that watches that as well.
Okay, excellent. I clicked on a button and lost our screen. So I clicked on a button to sign my page and messed up the whole system. I'm still getting used to the way that Rumble does their thing on there. But thanks again, Dave. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Nico, over there. Guys, this has been a phenomenal discussion. I'll look forward to more people tuning in. We'll pull some clips and sound bites out of it, and we'll get that done. But thanks again, Dave. We'll talk to you soon. With that, guys, we will catch you.